Greetings, you unmanageable horde of Death Company, and welcome to Codex Compliant.
Let's head back to 2nd edition, where things are getting awfully angelic.
When it comes to variant Space Marine chapters, Games Workshop has gone back and forth on how they've chosen to format their rulebooks. Sometimes they have standalone codices, and sometimes their books are simply supplements to the main Space Marine one. And their indecision is not really surprising, since both methods have their advantages and disadvantages.
If they're a supplement, the books can be slimmer and don't need to repeat a bunch of stuff from the main book, but that also means you need to buy, rifle through, and lug around an extra book to play. Standalone codices allow everything to be in one place, but at the same time, a certain percentage of it is always going to be basically identical to the vanilla Marine Codex. So if you need multiple of them, it's hard to avoid the fact that you're buying multiple copies of what can feel like the same book in a different livery. But this kind of thing was seemingly not really a consideration in 1996 when they put out Codex Angels of Death, which contained 2 army lists which were not only nearly identical to each other, but were also nearly identical to the army list from an existing book. And now we're going to try and make talking about that entertaining. After a brief word from today's sponsor.
Last year we did a sponsorship with TUSC, a game created by small independent tabletop game studio Sword and Board Games, founded by friend of the channel, Lamenter. You folks seem to get a kick out of what TUSC was doing, so Sword and Board has asked us to do another sponsorship for TUSC's first expansion, TUSC Medieval Warfare. This is an expansion geared towards playing games set in pre-modern fantasy or historical settings, and includes an expanded Wargear list containing 20 new melee weapons, and rules for black powder guns like muskets and matchlocks. It also has an expanded roster of spells and rules for fielding bestial monsters. You know, big guys like dragons, demon knights, or giants. So if you bought TUSC after watching the last ad, then you can purchase TUSC Medieval Warfare to either spice up your current science fiction games with some antique flair, or run games or campaigns set in medieval or colonial fantasy settings. And maintaining Sword and Board Games' commitment to accessibility and affordability, the expansion is only $5. And given that the book is distributed digitally, then it should never be affected by whatever bizarre tariffs get applied this week. Anyway, that makes the cost of the rulebook and expansion a mere $15. Check out the links in the description. And now back to talking about Space Marines or whatever.
Angels of Death was written by Rick Priestley and Jervis Johnson, and, although the cover art by Jeff Taylor only features the Blood Angels, the book focuses on both the Blood Angels and the Dark Angels. Both of these chapters were featured in the very first 40k rulebook, and between then and 2nd edition, when this book was released, they gained a handful of traits that would make them a little different from other more generic chapters. And so, since by this point 40k had moved over to the Codex system, it was decided that they needed their own book. In hindsight, they probably didn't, but they got one, so let's take a look at it anyway.
First off, we'll check out the Fluff. We start with a short history on Space Marines and the Horus Heresy, which, shockingly, considering the content of the rest of the book, was not just a reprint of what was in the Ultramarines Codex. In fact, at the end of the section it's like, if you want to know more, go read these other books, one of which is Codex Ultramarines. Also, love this extra spiky art of Horus with his big rain boots on. This was then followed by a section on Space Marine power armour that gives a lot of genuinely interesting details, like how the ceramite plates of it have a honeycomb design to dissipate and localise damage, or how it's a bit over 250 pounds in weight, or that the overlapping plates of Mark II Crusade armour were a right bugger to repair. To get onto the chapters themselves, it started with the Dark Angels, and the modern backstory for them is pretty much nailed down here. The Primarch Lion L. Johnson ends up on Caliban and is found and befriended by Luther. He then rises in the ranks of the Society and is eventually rediscovered by the Emperor and given the Dark Angels Legion to command. But resentment between Luther and the Lion builds until it spills over during the Horus Heresy, when a chunk of the Legion defects with a Chaos-empowered Luther, leading to the destruction of Caliban, the disappearance of Johnson, and the capture of Luther.
The Dark Angels would, going forward, keep this mini-heresy a closely guarded secret, with only those at the very top of the present-day chapter aware of the full scale of it. Shamed by this, the Dark Angels, with their specialised all-Terminator armoured Deathwing Company, and bike and landspeeder fetishist Ravenwing Company, would seek out surviving renegade Dark Angels, known as the Fallen, with righteous zeal. And torture. They employ a whole lot of torture by interrogator chaplains. It's kind of like a huge deal for them. And since this was long before the return of the Lion, that's pretty much where the story stayed for a long time. Also, since I don't know when we'll get to mention this again, many of you probably know that the Primarch and the chapter appear to take their name from the 1893 poem, The Dark Angel by Lionel Johnson. The poem itself is generally understood to be about the then deeply Catholic Johnson's struggle with the fact that he was also gay, a thing you can tell caused him a lot of anguish. Which not only ties into the Dark Angels chapter's secret that they must hide and seek redemption from, in ways that don't really look a whole lot like actual redemption to me, but is mostly an illustration of how awful internalized homophobia can be and is just super depressing. Also, just to put it out there, as far as anyone can glean, the rumour that the Rock, the remnant of Caliban the Dark Angels use as a base, is named after an old Nottingham gay bar seems to be entirely fabricated. There's Rock City, but the closest that that's ever been to a gay bar is when I saw Electric Six at a different venue just around the corner. There is, however, Nottingham Castle that's built on a big rock called Castle Rock, so if it is named after a place in Nottingham, there are other contenders. Plus, if the Rock was based on any bar, it'd be Ye Olde Trip to Jerusalem. I mean, come on. Okay, let's talk about Vampire Space Marines now.
The Blood Angels' backstory is also broadly the same as their modern day one, with the literally angelic and only mildly mutated Primarch Sanguinius landing upon Baal Secundus and rising to power on the planet before the coming of the Emperor and his handing over of the Blood Angels Legion to Sanguinius. Sanguinius was the bestest, most handsome boy ever, until he fought Horus and became a very handsome corpse. Like the Dark Angels, the Blood Angels have some dark secrets. There's the Black Rage, wherein a Blood Angel is plagued by visions of Sanguinius's last battle with Horus and goes into a rage, unable to tell friend from foe. Those who are too far gone will be inducted into the Black Armoured Death Company, seeking an honourable demise on the battlefield, which is a reworking of an older thing from Rogue Trader where the Black Armoured Blood Angels with red crosses on them had taken a blood oath, but were similarly led by chaplains. There's also the Red Thirst, which makes them crave human blood, which, when combined with their fangs, long life, the fact that they sleep in sarcophagi, a general ageless beauty about them, and their commitment to the whole blood aesthetic, means they really aren't beating the space vampire accusations anytime soon. Granted, 40k already had a kind of space vampire from first edition, but I suppose it's a big universe, there's room for multiple types. Which just makes me wonder what a 40k version of What We Do in the Shadows would be like. One big thing that was later changed that's in here is that it's implied the Blood Angels simply did not exist before Sanguinius was found by the Emperor. They were made specifically for him afterwards, so any pre-Sanguinius history of the 9th Legion from later releases isn't really compatible with this telling of it.
We were also told of the successor chapters for each of the factions, along with the vaguest of descriptions for them. On the Dark Angel side, we had the Angels of Vengeance. They retained the pre-heresy Black Dark Angel scheme. The Angels of Absolution, they all dress like they're in the Deathwing, and the Angels of Redemption, who are especially zealous in their hunt for the Fallen. Over in Blood Angels Town, there was the Angels Vermilion. They're shy. The Flesh Terrors, who could do with being a little bit more shy. The Blood Drinkers, big fans of the Spacebook. The Angels Sanguine, they have a dark secret. Presumably even darker than the already dark secrets all Blood Angels have. And the Angels in Carmine. They're workaholics. Sadly, the Lamenters aren't here, but that's understandable since they weren't yet stated to be Blood Angels' successors at this point in time. And it was quite possible they were all dead anyway. Still, it would have been nice to have someone rocking something other than mostly red. I suppose, after all that, we do actually need to talk about those army lists now.
Okay, so the vanilla Space Marine army list from Codex Ultramarines was all these things here. We have a whole video talking about it if you want more detail on that. Here we're just going to focus on what's different in Angels of Death. Also, yes, we have a green screen now. Be afraid. So, starting with the Dark Angels, they get a special captain who can ride around in a land speeder if they want, because they're the master of the Raven Wing. They don't have regular veterans, and their attack bikes and land speeders are in the squads category rather than support. Also, those can both be in squadrons. Blood Angels get Death Company, and instead of veteran squads, they get veteran assault squads. And that's about it. Even the flavour text for the generic units was copied wholesale from the vanilla Codex. Okay, there's obviously more to them, but the basic lists are mostly the same as the Codex Ultramarines list and as each other, leaving a light garnish of new stuff to make each of them feel distinct. For the Dark Angels, that garnish mostly centred around the Deathwing and Raven Wing. Raven Wing members would spend so much time in the saddle as to raise certain hygiene issues, but it meant that they could re-roll failed bike skid tests. They also didn't suffer penalties for firing whilst moving fast. Plus they got the Jink special rule, adding a -1 to the hit rolls of anyone shooting at them. Not sure how intentional it was, but you could also technically just field your Master of the Raven Wing on foot, which feels demeaning. Also, bizarrely, there's no pictures of Ravenwing minis in here at all, and the only piece of art of them is that one piece used for the cover of a Saxon album. The Deathwing, to which, along with their Terminators, most of the Dark Angel characters belonged, were fearless regardless of the situation, and so were entirely immune to psychology. Which was, as ever, a funny sentence to say, but it just meant that you couldn't inflict things like the fear or terror status upon them. You could also have a Master of the Deathwing, but that just replaced the regular Terminator Captain slot, and neither they nor the Master of the Raven Wing were specific characters with names yet, so you were free to make up your own. The Raven and Deathwing buffs did also make the affected units more expensive points-wise too, which I suppose is fair.
The Blood Angels assault veterans were essentially the same as the regular veteran squad, but could be heavily customised to give them whatever mix of melee weapons you wanted, in a manner that regular veteran squads could not. That level of customisation was also afforded to the new Death Company unit. And at this point you realise that the cover of the book, which you may have noticed was 90% Death Company, wasn't just a stylistic choice. You could actually do that. Although you could only have one Death Company squad in an army, there was also no limit to how many Marines could be in it as long as there were at least 5 of them. So it was entirely possible to have an army that was just an army commander and one huge terrifying blob of like 50 Death Company. However, you did need a chaplain to lead the squad, since otherwise they start ignoring unit coherency and started charging whoever was closest as individual models. And knowing how 2nd edition's melee combat worked, that feels like it'd get very confusing very quickly. I mean, as if any melee with 50 Death Company would be a picnic. They also always had frenzy and couldn't turn it off, which, I mean, makes sense. I can see why Death Company being terrifying was something people brought up when we asked what people remembered about the book.
On top of that, Death Company had an interesting wounds situation. They had 1+1 wounds. Not 2, 1+1. This was because the +1 was a temporary wound supplied to them by being ever so cross on the battlefield. But once the game was over, that would wear off and they'd lose the temporary wound and succumb to their injuries. So any Death Company Marine who ended the battle with 1 wound remaining would die after it. So those casualties would have to be taken into account for victory point purposes. Although, since we said you could do what was on the cover, we do feel the need to mention that there are a couple of impossible weapon loadouts on there. You could not give a Death Company Marine a missile launcher, for example, which is absolutely the right call as they 100% could not be trusted with one. Interestingly, the allies available to each force were all a little different too. The base Ultramarines list allowed you to pick allies from Space Marines, Imperial Guard, Imperial Agents, Squats, and Eldar, but you couldn't take avatars. The Blood Angels ally list was the same, except the avatar exception is gone. The avatar of the bloody-handed god obviously vibing with the whole blood theme the BAs have.
The Dark Angels, on the other hand, could only take allies from other Space Marines, Imperial Guard, and Imperial Agents, not willing to even entertain the question of whether avatars are cool with them or not. And the Squats were just not human enough for them, apparently. They also specifically called out that they will fight alongside the Space Wolves, who they have a feud with, but I can't imagine they're super happy about it. A feud that, as someone with a Space Wolves army, I have an absolutely neutral opinion on. The two lists in Angels of Death shared the same basic Wargear list, and the stuff available was identical to the Codex Ultramarines list outside of one thing. Sort of. So the Ultramarines version of the Dreadnought Wargear had a couple of issues. It had multi-melter down twice, and had an option for a heavy flamer with built-in Stormbolter, which was a very odd option that doesn't line up with any traditional Dreadnought loadout. In Angels of Death, the multi-melter duplication was fixed, and the heavy flamer with extra DACA was replaced with a lightning claw with built-in heavy flamer, which we assume was what it was intended to be all along, since that's what Bjorn had in the Space Wolf Codex from years earlier. Just to be awkward though, it seems that there are also copies of Angels of Death out there that have the DACA flamer option as well as the double multi-melters. So the logical assumption is that there was a running change where they fixed those bits for later printings, and ours is one of those. This is exactly the kind of niche information we're here for, so thank you to K. Ebenrai on Blue Sky for letting us know about it. So the simple Wargear was basically the same as in Codex Ultramarines, but where it did vary was in the Wargear cards that characters could take. However, despite some being able to be taken by regular characters, they were all there because they were Wargear for the special characters, so I suppose we should talk about those now.
The Dark Angels got Commander Azrael, Supreme Grandmaster of the Dark Angels, Keeper of the Truth, BSC, SSC. He had some fancy bits of Wargear. As well as a combi weapon, he had Lion L. Johnson's helm that created a 3-inch force field, and the Sword of Secrets, a powerful sword which we bring up mostly because we always forget how deep you needed to dig into your polyhedral dice sets for 2nd edition's armor penetration rules. Also, the helm was carried by the first mini of a Watcher in the Dark, one of the weird little guys from Caliban, and we do love a weird little guy. Wait, the version of the Watcher in here was slightly different to the version that ended up being sold. The final version had a wreath around the helmet and it had a lion on it rather than a skull. I had never noticed that before, and I've painted the damn thing twice. Oh, and there's also this classic diorama with both Azrael and the Watcher in it by Mike McVeigh in the front of the book, which I'm bringing up because you'll only yell at us if we don't mention it. Then there was Ezekiel, Grand Master of Librarians. Our favourite thing about him is that he lost his eye during War Groblonic. And Groblonic is just a wonderful word to say. I don't know how you will fit this into your day-to-day speech, but you should absolutely try. Groblonic. But B, they spelled Wah as just Wah, which sounds adorable, more Waluigi than Warboss. Oh, and Ezekiel on the tabletop, he's got a book or whatever. Interrogator Chaplain Asmodai had a knife that hurt so bad you counted as a casualty if it wounded you, regardless of how many wounds you had left. And there were also a couple of unique playable characters to this book. Brother Bethor, bearer of the Sacred Standard, is the bearer of the Sacred Standard. Or more specifically, he's the bearer of one of 3 Sacred Standards that each gave a unique buff to Dark Angel units in its vicinity. Then there's Saphon, Grand Master of Chaplains. He was basically a really inspirational chaplain and, based on his name, possible lesbian. Actually, here's an interesting thing that our mate Rufus the Wizard pointed out when we said we were covering this book. Asmodai's mini very clearly has a power sword and Crozius, and although he can be given a power sword, the actual rules for him don't have one equipped as a default. In fact, he's oddly customizable for a special character. But do you know who did have a Crozius and power sword by default? Saphon, and he never got a mini. So it leaves you to wonder if the Asmodai mini was originally supposed to be Saphon at some point.
On the Blood Angels side of things, they got Commander Dante, Lord of the Blood Angels, who seems like he'd be terrifying to fight. I mean that literally, he had the death mask of Sanguinius, which caused terror. Also, he could have a special bodyguard of 5 jump pack veterans, which are as close to Sanguinary Guard as you're getting in this book. Chief Librarian Mephiston, Lord of Death, was... well, he lived up to that name by being a faster-than-average melee powerhouse that also had psychic powers. He could transfix his enemies into having 0 weapon skill, and although his entire deal was that he'd conquered the Red Thirst, he occasionally dabbles in it, ignoring the battle to drink the blood of downed enemies. just in case the allusions to him being the most vampire in this chapter of vampires wasn't apparent enough from the Mark Gibbons art that accompanies it. Art that you may recognise as the basis for his current mini, in fact. Corbulo, the sanguinary priest, was also here, waving his cup around to make people run faster, as well as brother Captain Tycho, who hated orcs and, due to having digilasers, could legitimately claim to possess finger guns. The only special character unique to this book for Blood Angels was veteran Sergeant Cluton, guardian of the Shroud of Sanguinius. He carried the remains of the battle standard that was used to cover Sanguinius' dead body in an iron box with a built-in stasis field. In-game, he could turn off the stasis field to make all Blood Angels within 12 inches go into a frenzy. He was also so old he was said to have been a sergeant in Dante's scout squad, and Dante has been chapter master for 1,100 years at this point, so Cluton would need to be pretty damn old even for a Blood Angel.
Finally, let's peek at the minis in the colour section, and, well, this was made during GW's Red era, when even armies that you don't think of as being red could end up with a remarkable amount of red on them. Our favourite example being Goth Orcs, who are described as having a predominantly black colour scheme, yet are significantly more red than the Evil Sons in this era. This not only led to Dark Angels with more vibrant red on them than modern eyes may expect, but the reddest Blood Angels you'll ever see. I know they've always been nearly entirely red, and the black pauldron rims mean that, technically speaking, they had a lower percentage of red on them here than usually presented now, but there's just something about the way they're presented and photographed at this time that makes them feel extra red. Probably something to do with the fact that Blood Angel Orange was a paint for a while, led to some very vibrant highlights. It's also quite fun to see a Blood Angels Dreadnought with Furioso written on it, without it actually being specifically a Furioso Dreadnought, since those weren't a thing. A Furibundus Dreadnought, yes, technically, but not a Furioso. Those came later.
So, has Angels of Death justified its existence?
Maybe. Maybe not, but what can? Why does any rulebook exist? Why does anything exist?
Could the bits of this book that we knew just have been a handful of White Dwarf articles? I mean, sure, some parts absolutely were, to be honest. Whether for promotional reasons, such as some of the Dark Angel special characters appearing in White Dwarf 193, or the complete Death Company rules that were in White Dwarf 168 from all the way back in December of 1993, plenty of the stuff in here did appear in GW's magazine. But you go too far down that rabbit hole and you end up with first edition where half the game was scattered throughout White Dwarf, so sometimes it makes sense to just have it all in one book, even if it was all available elsewhere. Ultimately though, Angels of Death started the ball rolling on the BAs and the DAs needing to distinguish themselves a bit more. And so there's things like Sanguinary Guard, or whatever these things are supposed to be, that might not have existed if they didn't spin off into their own book this early.
Plus, it's not like the Space Wolf book from 2nd didn't also have a lot of overlap with the Ultramarines Codex, it just stood out less since it had a few more distinguishing quirks, came out first, and just had the one list rather than two nearly identical ones sitting right next to each other. To be fair, we have had multiple people tell us that Angels of Death is one of their favourite codices ever, so whatever we might think of the book, reading it in the modern day, it's absolutely left its mark on people. And for saying we actively avoided talking about all the duplicated stuff, it certainly didn't make this video any shorter, so I suppose there's demonstrably something engaging about what's in here. One could also posit that it does also illustrate that GW taking a Warhammer sub-faction and splitting them off into their own book long before they really have enough bespoke units to fully justify it is not a modern invention. It's something they've done for as long as there's been army books. Now, there would be another, sort of, Codex Angels of Death 20 years later for 7th edition 40k, but that was entirely unrelated, just being a supplement adding bits and pieces for any Space Marine chapter. And as for the Blood and Dark Angels, they would go on to having their own solo codices after 2nd edition, and have to grapple with the issues of format mentioned at the start of this video forevermore. But for one brief moment they were combined, bound together by the shared theme of the dark secrets they keep.
And the fact that their names were kind of similar.
Thank you all very much for watching. If you enjoyed the experience, then please let us know with a like, a comment, or maybe even subscribing. Thank you to TUSC for sponsoring this video, and to our patrons, whose names are scrolling past right now, for making this all possible. If you'd like to join those names, please check out patreon.com/snipeandwib, and you'll also get these videos a little earlier, as well as see exclusive videos like this one, where I talked about the ins and outs of collecting an old hammer army in the present day. It's all available for as little as $1 a month. Just don't do it through the Apple version of the app, it'll cost you more. Just do it literally anywhere else. As for this video's question for you to answer in the comments to confound people who don't watch this far, well, I've just looked around on my desk for inspiration and seen the last Transformer I bought, so what was your favourite toy line as a kid? Mine was actually Lego. Anyway, look after yourselves and look after each other. We'll see you next time.